All right, this week we are addressing basically the movements of a classical work and what they mean. And we're going to start with the Minuet-Trio because it extends nicely from the rounded binary discussion from last module. And we're going to move forward from there into the rondo and the sonata form and sort of talk about what we can expect from certain pieces, what the tradition of naming a movement means, and how to sort of navigate all that information you get when you experience the title of a classical work, what that all means. So the first thing to understand is the essence of the classical style, what that really means. And we've sort of talked about this in the periphery, but let's address this sort of directly, that the classical style is from the height of the 18th century into the last part of the first part of the 19th century. There's a real big focus on the humanism, basically, and that the human intellect was starting to reach a sort of a zenith to them, or at least at that time. And they were really interested in the clarity of art and the balance that certain things should have. Like a good example is a lot of the architecture from that time period. If you think about even sort of American government architecture from the late 18th century to early 19th century, you think of the Capitol building, you think of the Washington Monument, you think of the Lincoln Memorial. All those things are very symmetrical and clearly boxed in with regular shapes, triangles, rectangles, columns that are evenly spaced. You have if you think about the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., you've got the Senate on one side, you've got the House of Representatives on the other, and you have the big dome in the middle. So it's a very symmetrical design. It's very clearly shown from the exterior what it is and what it's for. In the classical style, musically, we're also looking at that sense of symmetry and balance, clarity of form and function, and all the way down to each phrase, each melody, each motive, all the way down to periodic structure and all that stuff. So we're focusing on the envisioning and the sort of hearing that kind of balance and clarity in the music. And we focus on this here because then we can project that upon all music going forward as a way to kind of understand expectations. So the classical style features clearly stated melody. There's a clear melody that is supported by harmony. You know, again, think of the architecture of like a Lincoln Memorial. You have columns that clearly support the top or something to that effect. There's clear phrasing, clear cadence structures, and we get what we call a homophonic texture, meaning that there's one primary melody and the rest is subversive to that, is accompaniment. We have clearly stated forms that are standardized and expected. And that's what we're going to focus on this module, is the standard forms of these pieces. And then we get to interpret them as sort of something that is deviated from. So we get to sort of appreciate the artfulness of somebody like Beethoven, who stretched the boundaries of expected forms. And we can also talk about what absolute music means. Absolute music is music that is non-representational, meaning that it's not necessarily about anything. There's not a story behind this music. There's not necessarily a narrative, but underneath it all, it's really more about the structure holding it up, the phrase structure and things like that. Whereas in the Romantic era, a lot of that music was very topical and about poetry or feelings or emotions and romantic themes and things like that. But the classical style is generally very absolute, and you can see that reflected in the titles. Titles are like Symphony in E flat major, movement 3. It's very, very direct and dry, to be honest. So we can break this down into a series of other categories. So all the pieces from the classical era featured either large ensemble pieces or small ensemble pieces. Large ensemble works were the symphony and the concerto. The concerto basically has a featured soloist with a symphony orchestra accompanying them. So these are large forces, lots of people. And we can break these two categories down into either 3 or 4 movement designs. So the symphony is generally a 4 movement work. The concerto is generally a 3 movement work. So the concerto is something that features 3 movements, and it also features a soloist. A symphony does not always feature have one featured soloist. It's really more about the evenness of all the performers in a symphony orchestra, and that is in a 4 movement design. Small genres are string quartet. The string quartet is like a symphony in that there are only 4 persons, but they are all sort of even, and there are 4 movements to the design. A sonata is like the concerto, where we have 3 movements and there is 1 featured soloist with a pianist. Or a piano sonata would be just the piano. But there is basically 1 featured person and only 3 movements. So in a 4 movement work, either a symphony or a string quartet, we have these expectations for form. We have the first movement, which is a sonata allegro form. We have some sort of a second movement, which is sometimes open in terms of formal structure. It can be slow, usually. Sometimes it's a simple binary or 2-part form. The third movement is a Minuet-Trio. And the fourth movement is usually fast in a rondo or theme and variations, a lighter sort of design. The purpose of this design is twofold. Once it's also there's a key design to all these 4 movements. So if there's a symphony in E flat major, for instance, your opening movements will be in E flat major. The middle movements may deviate from them, and just like a rounded binary form, you start and you end in the same key, but there's a deviation in the middle. Also, it's about melody and theme. So the first movement will be based on one idea, the second on another, the third on another, and then the fourth, this is usually in 3/4. This is usually a slow, like lyrical movement. And then your first movement is a sonata, which is a clearly heard form from the time period. And your fourth movement is usually a lighter fare, like a rondo where there's a lot of repetition, so that you're hearing things go by quickly and you're able to identify motives and phrases. A 3-movement work, like a sonata or concerto, is basically based on the focus of one performer. It's usually a sonata that starts out the form, and a rondo, again, a lot like the symphony. But in the middle, there's only 1 movement in the middle. It's called a slow movement, and that can take on many different forms. So if we apply those expectations to the title of a work, you'll see at the top of classical works, you have all this information. And I like this slide. It's got a lot of stuff on it, so it's a little complex, but not really. It defines what's going on in a title: genre, key, opus, number, movement. The genre is the type of work. Basically, it says string quartet, or it would be piano sonata, or violin concerto, or etc. Symphony. It'll tell you the type of work. The key is next, so that'll tell you the key, the basic key of the whole thing. So going back to a slide back here, if our symphony is in F major, that means that the whole movement structure is based on F major, but there might be modulations. There might be like your second and third movement may not be in the home key. Maybe it goes to the key of the dominant or the relative major. There's other places that these movements can go internally, but overall, we're going to begin and end in F major. Opus. An opus means a publication group or a collection of works that are published in one go. You can think of them as like collections or volumes or sets of works. Often a composer like Haydn, who wrote tons and tons of music, would publish them in groups. So Opus 74 was a whole bunch of string quartets. Sometimes composers will write things in sets of 12 or 6. And so you'll get a publication number 74. So Haydn was extremely prolific, wrote tons and tons of things. And so his publisher grouped things into opus numbers. And there are typically more than one work in an opus. And then your number shows in what position this group of movements is in the opus. So this is kind of a hierarchical system. And then the movement is the movement within the one number within the opus. So an opus is a publication group. So there's a bunch of multi-movement works in the opus. The number is the position of this piece in the publication group. And then the movement is the focused movement of that piece. So in this case, this is the third movement of a 4-movement piece because it's a string quartet. It's in Opus 74. It's the second string quartet in Opus 74. This particular one is in F major, and this tells you what it is. And this tells you basically the subtitle, the Minuetto, right here. So our first form that we're going to focus on is the Minuet-Trio form, and it is the most, it's a very standardized third movement form. It's usually the third movement of a 4-movement piece. So that means a string quartet, symphony, something like that. Although sometimes in sonatas, there's also a Minuet-Trio movement, but we're expecting this to be a part of a larger work in some capacity. The Minuet-Trio evolved from the Baroque dance waltz. So it is in 3/4 time, and it has 2 sections where the first one is repeated at the end. The minuet is often in the tonic key, major or minor, and the trio is often in a closely related key or parallel key. So if the minuet is in major key, the trio will often be in either the relative minor, the parallel minor, or the dominant. If the minuet is in a minor key, your trio will be in the relative major, the parallel major, usually. The minuet is repeated again after the trio, and we'll often see minuet da capo at the end of that trio, meaning you play the minuet, you play the trio, and then you get to the da capo, and then you go back and play the minuet. So we're calling this a compound ternary form because we have 3 parts, and the minuet and trio are each usually a rounded binary form. And so that is a really great way to get into compound forms. Compound ternary is a 3-part melodic design where the B section can stand on its own and is in its own key. And so we think of that as large A, large B, large A. It's compound because each section has unto itself a binary, a rounded binary form. The A section and the B section is each a rounded binary form. So it's like a form within a form, which is why it's called compound. A Minuet-Trio is an example of compound ternary, typically, because it goes minuet, trio, minuet. The trio is in a related key, but it is all in that related key, right? The beginning to end of the trio is in a key, has some sort of independence. And both the minuet and the trio are individual rounded binary forms. So in this case, you might recognize this piece from your exam. Let me play this. The minuet is entirely in E-flat major, begins and ends in E-flat major. Even though it modulates towards the end of the first half, it's still all in E-flat major. Digression. our trio, C minor. From beginning to end, it is entirely in C minor. Because of the whole thing being in a separate key, essentially, we consider this a B section entirely. But within the B section is a rounded binary with its own digression, its own key relationships, and we at the end we get a minuet da capo. It's in 3/4, and we have these two keys are relatives to each other, right? E flat major and C minor. So at the end of this movement, we'll go back to the beginning. To repeat A, unchanged. So it's not A prime, it's just an A because we're just replaying this material at the end. Sometimes at the end, the repeats are not taken, which is cool. So the piece in its entirety is an ABA structure. The middle movement, or the middle part, the B, is your trio, which is in its own key. So if we look at this sort of chart, we can see that from the exam, we had these two things. They are both continuous rounded binary, and they each have their own sort of phrase structure. This one is also continuous rounded binary. They have forms unto themselves. And since we go from minuet to trio back to minuet, we consider this a compound ternary form. Other examples, like this one, have a similar structure. This is a divertimento. It's a little keyboard piece in G major. Haydn has its own, basically his own cataloging system. It's called Hoboken, like Hoboken, New Jersey. It's named after a German guy or person. And so this is his individual opus number 11, and this is the presto movement. And so you'll find that this is a major minuet and trio. The minuet is in G major. The trio is in G minor, right? So if we look at the trio starting at measure 25, it has its own key structure. And then at the end, this is in G minor. By the end, we have a cadence in G, and then we go back da capo. It says da capo, I'll hold. And so it goes back to the beginning, and then you play to the end of the first half. So this is minuet, trio, minuet. And since each of them is a rounded binary, this is compound ternary form.
25.5.
Again, the language is extremely clear. This is sectional rounded binary because we stay in G. Trio, G minor. This cadence is in D here, so it is continuous. Digression. Half cadence. Same material as the beginning of the trio, so it returns back to minuet. Digression because our first half did not modulate. So a formal diagram would show this design. This is right out of your Late's textbook, chapter 20, I believe, where our first section, our first minuet, has this design. It's basically a rounded binary form. Our second section in G minor has its own key structure, rounded binary, and then we repeat the first part again. I disagree with this little prime. It shouldn't be there. It's not changed. So this is simply a restatement of A. So there's a couple of more examples here. We have, again, another example by Beethoven. This is from chapter 25 of your Lates. I was wrong just now saying that it was chapter 20. It's 25. We are looking at this as a Minuet-Trio in F minor. The trio is in the parallel major. Okay. Our minuet is our continuous rounded binary with a Monty digression here. And our trio is a continuous rounded binary with a Fonte digression. And it has its own sort of melodic content and texture. We'll listen to a little bit of this.
25.9.
You can hear the style of Beethoven differs from Haydn in that it is a little less clear and has more fun playing around with your expectations. A lot of phrase extensions. Off to F major. Digression. With lots of extra notes. Half cadence. Return to the original trio material. Back to minuet. And it seems the Lates recordings do not take repeats. Digression. Piece. And again, it has this this design to it, which is more appropriately labeled with no prime on the A because we're just simply repeating the minuet. It has internal key relationships, but we do end up in the same key at the end of this minuet. So our B section has also a rounded binary form, and then we return to our A section. And there are other examples here, but what I'd like to do is just kind of summarize by saying our rounded binary form has this design typically, where we have maybe one or two phrases at the beginning, and a sectional binary will remain in the home key, and our digression usually basically stays in the same key, and then we have some sort of authentic cadence in the primary key. Continuous binary, rounded binary form has a move to the dominant or relative major in the second half, and then we return via digression to come back to the home key at the end. Ternary form, however, has three distinct sections: minuet, trio, minuet. Our B section is solidly established in a secondary key. It's a contrast to A. There's no restatement of the original material. So this B section is almost harmonically independent. It's basically on its own. And so that's why the Minuet-Trio is a really great model for compound ternary, because these sections unto themselves have rounded binary forms, okay, and their own keys. So that basically sums up our distinctions between rounded binary and compound ternary.